Right. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Franz, good evening to you. I know you're ahead of us, but yeah. Anyways, what a treat for us to have the music director of the Cleveland Orchestra, Franz Welser-Möst, join us. What an honor it is to have you, Franz. Thanks so much for being with us.
Sure.
Really appreciate it. We have the whole orchestra here, and last week we did a little bit of a dive into Dvorak New World, which is a piece that a lot of the musicians here have been wanting to play, and obviously couldn't do this year, but they love Dvorak. So we just thought this is a great time to talk about it and to delve into it. And I'm actually going to keep my questions short because I would prefer that they have more time to ask. But I guess I'll get started by the first thing I assisted you on was Cunning Little Vixen, and I remember at the time you said those Czech composers, Czech, Dvorak, they were your neighbors essentially. And if you wouldn't mind sharing just what it is you find in music from that area, these composers, that is so compelling to you, because I know you love Dvorak and all these composers. Yeah.
There's this saying that every good Austrian has a Czech grandmother. So we are sort of related, really, which goes back to the Austrian Empire, of course, of the 19th century. But what I find actually moving in that kind of music is always when you talk about classical music, I think you should have also a look at folk music, which was written or is passed on. Some of that music never has been written down of that area. If you dive into Sibelius, you should know a little bit about, how the folk music goes. And the same is here. And when you listen to Czech Bohemian folk music, the folk songs, there is always an at least underlying melancholy. The Czechs are people who very easily fall homesick. And so it's that comes through in that kind of music. And I think especially with Dvorak 9, where he was in America, and we know from letters and comments that he was homesick. And I think a lot of that is reflected in his music, always.
I think you hear it in the beginning of that symphony, right from the very opening with the cello, this feeling of homesickness and melancholy.
Yeah, big time. And I mean, then if you pay attention how he put it on a page of paper, when you hear it played sometimes, you think it's sort of fat and whatnot, but he writes it in a 4/8. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a lightness, and that's really the art. It's the lightness creates at the same time the pain. You know what I mean? It's that there was a famous Czech writer, and he created that saying that a smile and a tear at the same time. Yeah. And that's very much what I think this opening is.
Yeah. And of course, that is pianissimo, which is, I think, often ignored, right?
Yeah, pianissimo. If you played really pianissimo, then even more so, you get that feeling we just talked about, because it's sort of distant, and that kind of distance creates then the longing for what is beyond that distance. And so I think that's really the difficulty in that opening.
I love that you mentioned folk music. The first time I did Dvorak 8, I remember someone came backstage and started singing the middle part of the third movement, like with words. And I, as an American, but that had a profound effect where you recognize just the closeness of that music, to people, and how then Dvorak puts it in notation for us to hear,
that was actually sort of yeah, I would call it even a sort of sport with classical music. When they like the tune, if, for instance, if you look at the music by Johann Strauss or Joseph Strauss, or even Brahms and other symphonic music, when people liked it, they immediately found a sort of rhyme to that, the texts, words for it.
Yeah.
So I think that was also a way of appreciation, really, that it stuck with you because it was a good tune, and you sort of create a song out of it.
Yeah. I just have a couple more questions before I'll open it up. But obviously, this is a piece that when you say top symphonies, it's pretty up there. And what else comes to mind when you think about this piece in terms of just why it's had such a power as one of the greatest symphonies ever written?
I think it has to do with the simplicity of the tunes.
Yeah,
that's really key. I mean, when you compared to like Dvorak 7, which is such a wonderful piece, but yet the tunes in the ninth are so much more simple. There's in a good sense a naivety which immediately catches your ear. It's it's so ironic because yesterday I drove in my car and I switched on the classical radio station in Austria, and there was the second movement of the piano sonata of Florence Price, which surprised me because Florence Price is not a big name over here. But so much of it reminded me of Dvorak 9, which I thought was really funny to discover that for me. I never had heard that sonata before, but it was because, Europeans say in Dvorak 9, there are these Indian folk songs or American folk songs, whatever you want to call it. And yet I think it's just a sentiment of what he heard in America. And to hear the same sort of sentiment in Florence Price's piano sonata was a joy for me to listen to that.
I think what you mentioned about simplicity is a hallmark of Dvorak, because actually a good chunk of this group worked on the string serenade in the fall. And
okay.
At the same piece, I mean, the material is absolutely simple, but yet all the magic he's able to create. And so we see that carry over in this piece as well. So before I open it up, this is a piece that's obviously, it's performed very often by professional orchestras. And sometimes, when you're playing it so often, it can be hard to find the inspiration. But I remember you telling me in Cleveland, you did it with the orchestra after having done Rusalka, which we haven't done. Obviously, we haven't done a deep dive, but I just thought it was so fascinating that after doing that piece, that opera that he wrote after the New World, all of a sudden it was a whole new experience playing the Dvorak 9. I just wonder if you could shed some light about that.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, it's fun to know the history of this, how it came about, because my predecessor used to do Dvorak 9 all the time. So when he left and when I came into office, the orchestra had signed a petition that Dvorak 9 should not be played for 5 years in a row. So, and I said, okay, 10 years, give it a rest. And every time I saw it on a program suggested, as mainly for Blossom, I crossed it off. And I said, no, absolutely not. It really needs a rest. And then we had planned Rusalka, which we took then also to the Salzburg Festival. And it was really a sort of ear opener for the orchestra because they could relate what they loved playing Rusalka, because it's such great music. And I told them the story and which tune means what and so on. And then, of course, I mean, being such great musicians, they immediately could relate to, oh, that's how it should go also in Dvorak 9. The same experience was a couple of years later when we did Rosenkavalier. After that, Till Eulenspiegel was a different piece for them, which means, you know, as a musician, you should try to get an as complete picture of a composer as possible. Knowing one piece is great, but knowing most of the pieces, and you see in the background my library, by the way, which is about a third of what it really is. You should, as much as you can know of a composer's work, it gives you more insight, and you can relate this to that and whatnot. So for all of a sudden, for the Cleveland Orchestra, for the musicians, Dvorak 9 was alive again, and not just a dead horse which you had to beat up over and over again.
Great, that's so wonderful. Look, COYO, this is your opportunity. I'm going to open the floor to you. Any questions you have about Dvorak, the New World music, you know, whatever. It's a great opportunity for you to ask. So I open the floor to you. And just don't be shy. Just go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
What do you think is the most distinctive feature between Dvorak's past symphonies and the New World? Like, what's the biggest difference?
You know, when you look at the early symphonies, he was still under so much influence of Johannes Brahms, partly under the influence of Wagner, trying to have success desperately, partly really trying desperately to have success. And when I'm not going through all the symphonies, but when you look at the seventh, you still can see and hear that there was still enough influence from Johannes Brahms, trying to not copy him, but sort of looking over his shoulder and saying, "Oh, Brahms is really famous. Maybe I could get there." And in the eighth, he turns already more towards being himself by trusting more his instincts when it comes to the sources of his inspiration, which again was his own folk music, the Bohemian folk music. And I think in Dvorak 9, he really dared to say, okay, I have to be my own man. And right from the beginning, or when you take like the opening of the second movement, or also the last movement, you never get the feeling anymore, oh, you know, he has studied his Beethoven, he has studied his Brahms, he has studied his Wagner. Like in Rusalka, as I mentioned it, you clearly, there are certain passages where people would think immediately, oh, that must be by Wagner, you know, like in the opening scene. Here in Dvorak, in his ninth symphony, I think it's really like also in the late symphonic poems, Water Sprite, Golden Spinning Wheel, all these pieces where he finally sort of has freed himself from all the big ghosts from the past and his presence. So I think that really sets Dvorak 9 apart from all previous symphonies.
And the connection with Brahms, you know, those of you who played Tragic Overture, you know, a couple of years ago, and if you don't know Dvorak 7, I mean, they are partner pieces. They go hand in hand. And
exactly.
And he even took a little bit of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto in the second theme, a little spin on that. It's very much, you know, there. So a couple questions in the chat. One is, how many times have you conducted Dvorak New World? And the second one is, how do you think Dvorak's life and music would have been different if he had not come to the United States?
First of all, you know, I always had the opinion that you only can appreciate the great masterpieces if you don't do them all the time. We talked about the Cleveland Orchestra. For me, that's always the same. You know, some conductors have a very small repertoire. Let's say they're lazy, and you know, I'm not saying that they can't deliver a very inspired performance, but for me personally, I just love looking at as much music as possible. And then when I come to Eroica or Beethoven 5 or Dvorak 9 or Brahms 2nd or Czech 5, these pieces which get most performances by any symphony orchestra in the world, I go, wow, my God, is that great? Is that wonderful? And it excites me that way. So, you know, and also the other part is that as music director, you have to make sure you want to get the best guest conductors, which is not always possible, unfortunately, because there's a lot of competition for the best ones, and you want them to be happy. So it took me actually a long time till I conducted Dvorak 9, because, you know, every time it was, yeah, that guest conductor, he doesn't have a big repertoire, but we want him to come, blah, blah, blah. So the first time I conducted Dvorak 9 was not before I reached the age of 35. I had done Dvorak 8, Dvorak 7, other pieces by smaller pieces by Dvorak, the Serenade and so on, but not Dvorak 9. And I've not conducted it very often. It was in 95, the first time. And the next time I conducted was in 2008 with Cleveland. And then I did it another time with Cleveland in Miami, and that was it, not more than that. And the second question, I think if Dvorak would not have come to America, you know, these are always speculations. So don't take me too seriously because it's speculating. I think that we talked about Florence Price, and you can hear the influences of American music in Dvorak 9. But other than that, I don't think it has influenced them terribly much. It's like, you know, Gustav Mahler came to America and Richard Strauss came to America, but in their music, you can't tell really that it influenced them terribly much. Having said that, also when they traveled to other countries, it didn't influence them terribly much.
We talked last week about how it's still a very Czech piece, the New World.
Yes.
Despite the time in America, we kind of talked about how and with a piece like that, there are some myths and some distortions, things like that. In the end, it's a very Czech piece, I think. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi. So I really like how in the beginning of this call, we just started talking about like the impact of Dvorak's music and like the idea of like the smile with the tear. I really like that. So relating to that idea, personally to you, what piece that Dvorak wrote do you think hit you like the most emotionally? Like which one, when you think of his repertoire, you immediately think like this one?
Stabat Mater.
Oh.
I think the Stabat Mater is just an extraordinary piece of music. There's so much depth and so much, you know, religion, faith, beliefs, all that are very personal things. And how he, when you look at other Stabat Maters, going back to Pergolesi or others, or Haydn and Schubert and so on, you they follow certain rules of the time, and Dvorak yet again finds an incredibly personal voice to put that text into music, which is, I think, I don't know any other Stabat Mater like that. It's really it doesn't get enough performances, I think. But it's a wonderful piece of music. But when I was young, sort of your age probably, not you, Vinay, all the others I don't see. Dvorak 8 was the first piece by Dvorak which really sort of I remember, and I remember that recording with the Berlin Phil and Herbert von Karajan, which I listened to over and over and over again.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, 8 is our first entrance into his world, so it makes sense. So,
but it's interesting because it's another symphony which a lot of conductors do. I've never conducted Dvorak 8 with a professional orchestra.
Okay.
Since I conducted it when I was 21, and since that time I've never conducted again.
Wow. Yeah, one would
happens.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat about we talked a lot about Dvorak 9 as such an essential piece, but are there others that come to mind that you hear a direct influence of it? Contemporary works after that, where you really hear the influence of the New World?
No, nothing. Right now, nothing comes to my mind. Sorry.
One piece that actually you mentioned Florence Price. I don't know if you know her first symphony.
Also, yes, I do.
That's one piece where it's like, okay, that's very much, E minor, similar thing. It kind of ends. Yeah. The first movement ends the same way as Dvorak, but besides that, it's hard. Yeah. Hard.
Yeah, but it speaks really for Dvorak 9 being such a unique and such a personal piece he wrote. Yeah. Because when somebody makes such a personal statement, that's really hard to follow. Or even if, that's sort of, for another composer, that's a mountain which you have real difficulties to climb that one. Yeah. And I think that speaks really for the qualities of the piece.
Mm-hmm. There's another question in the chat. This is actually a good question about just preparation. Question is, how many times would you say you listen to a piece, as you prepare to conduct it? But maybe that's a broader question, just in terms of how you prepare.
Yeah. I would say for the last about 30 years, I never listened to a piece to prepare. Yeah. Because I always say I'd rather make my own mistakes than the mistakes of other people. So I've heard colleagues of mine saying, oh, I listen to 3 different versions on YouTube and I take what I like. And I think that is sort of cheating. It's more than an easy route to take. So, I always try to prepare way in advance, which right now in the pandemic is a challenge because we're changing programs like 3 times a week. But I give you an example. The first time I conducted Tristan, I studied it for about 2 years. And, if it's a big symphony or for instance, right now in my library here, I've just before we started this, I looked at a piece by a contemporary German composer we're going to do in 1.5 years. So 1.5 years is sort of the right time to pick it up for the first time, sort of getting to know it on the edges and trying to come into the first contact with the piece.
Yeah. There's something to be said also for just the time that you're not actively looking at it, you know, that it's still rolling around in your subconscious, and that's part of the, you know, the.
You know, sometimes in a career when you're busy, you sometimes there's no other chance to learn something short notice.
Yeah.
But these are the pieces you forget also very quickly.
Yeah.
But if you have studied something really thoroughly, you open up a score 20 years later and it's totally familiar. So there's something to be said to put in a lot of work really early. As soon as you know, I'm going to do this piece, I'm like that. I want to see the score immediately. I want to, yeah, sort of get my first impressions.
All right. Let's see. There's a question in the chat. I think specifically to the New World. What are things for orchestra musicians to think about, you know, when encountering the Dvorak New World, you know, if they have not played it before?
I think one specific is with Dvorak's music, it always has to sing.
Yeah.
Every measure in that piece is basically a song. Yeah. It's a beautiful, simple song. Even in the scherzo or whatnot, it never should sound sort of percussive or you know, masculine, whatnot. There is always this underlying singing quality. And then, you know, that's also why I said in the beginning, you should know some folk music from which area of the world you ever do a piece. But when you know the hills in Bohemia, you know, with at least 80% of these hills are covered with huge trees, and there's a sort of stillness to that landscape, and a sort of what's the word? You know, there's nothing rough about that landscape. It's not like going to the Swiss Alps, you know. It's really it's smooth, and yet still there's this energy of what nature has. When you go into a big forest, you can feel that. So these are I think the significant things one should think about when you do this piece.
Great. Jackie, did you have a question?
Hi, so thinking about Symphony 9 and then the American quartet, I just wanted to ask like what you think changed in Dvorak's stay in America, because like they were wrote in the same year, but they obviously have such different color. So I wanted to hear like what you think he might have been going through.
You know, again, a lot of it is speculation, but we touched a little bit on the homesickness. I think also the artists who came to America at that time, and we should know in Cleveland, I mean, that was a time where Cleveland was the 5th biggest city in America. It was huge. And that was the time where Henry Ford actually made automobiles accessible for a big population. There was an industrial mechanical development which was so fast. So the little I know about, you know, how Dvorak, how Gustav Mahler, how Richard Strauss, who also came in the early 20th century to America, that the Europeans were basically overwhelmed with how powerful the developments of the industrial nation America, United States of America was. That was, I think, partly really shocking for them.
Thank you.
A couple more in the chat here. This is actually a good question about just conductor's role, in terms of in a performance. But how important to performance is the orchestra's emotional understanding of the piece? And I think that's a good question when talking about a piece that's very often played, where people can have different ideas, and how a conductor tries to project a vision, to execute the best performance.
I think it's very important. I think it's important that in the rehearsal process, the orchestra and the conductor find an understanding, and it's up to the orchestra to convince the orchestra that his view of the piece, his take on the piece, is a good one. So I think if you're clear in the rehearsal process what has to be expressed, or even better, to put it in a better way, what has to be conveyed to the audience, then I think you're on the right track. There was a famous German theater director in the 20th century, in this sort of post-Second World War time. He was really, at that time, he was the most famous stage director in the German-speaking world. His name was Fritz Kortner. And he said to his actors, he said, "You don't have to cry, the audience has to cry." Which means you have to know how to use the buttons when you push them. Like what Vinay said earlier on, if the opening is really soft, that's a way to push a button in the emotional reaction of an audience member. And so I did the other day, I did an interview with a Japanese journalist about Radu Lupu. And he never played loud. He actually, and I said to her, he knew what intimacy means when he played. And because she said that you always had the feeling with Radu that he just played for you, even though there were 2,000 other people around you. But that's what you call intimacy. And intimacy is, I think, the strongest effect music can have on people when it gets really personal, intimate. And so I think it's just when in the rehearsal process, an orchestra, the individual players have prepared their parts, but the conductor is there to give them a bigger view. It was in 2014, I conducted Rosenkavalier at the Salzburg Festival with the Vienna Phil. And the Vienna Phil plays Rosenkavalier every year at the Vienna State Opera. They know the piece really well. A lot of the young players actually didn't know really the text. They knew the music, but not what the music should convey. So I spent a lot of time in rehearsal telling them what the text says, because there's an interaction between the words and the sounds. So I think the role of the conductor is really to give the orchestra the bigger picture, where everyone knows then how to fit in.
A couple more in the chat. This is one you had mentioned, Franz, the landscape in Bohemia, that area of the world. But if we have any evidence about the American landscape, that it had an effect on Dvorak or reminded him of home, when he was writing works in America.
New England,
yeah,
yeah, sure. When you drive through New England, I think that's the most similar you get to Middle European and sort of a little more Northern European landscapes.
There's a question here. I guess, yeah, just kind of conductor life. How many hours of score study a day?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
You know, if, of course, it's not every day the same, but I would say that about 2 hours a day, that sort of, yeah. Sometimes you spend 5, 6, 7 hours with a piece. But like when I'm in Cleveland and I've got rehearsals, then Monday is my day off. That's where I spend most time with this course, preparing sort of the final preparation for the program, starting rehearsals on Tuesday. But then also every morning, I'm an early bird. I get up, I do my yoga exercises, and then I study. So I'm really well prepared when I go into rehearsal. And then I usually I've got the Friday mornings sometimes off, but Saturdays, Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings. Like now, I'm going to come to Cleveland on Tuesday, and I'm taking with me quite a few scores because I sort of know I've got time here and there where I can study new pieces.
Yeah. Sorry, this is go back. You mentioned Radulopu. I don't know if I don't know if everyone knows who he is. After this call, everyone go listen to Radulopu. Just
yes,
artists.
I would say Radulopu, if you would have to use one word to describe him, he stopped playing a couple of years ago because he's in very bad health. But in my lifetime, I've never heard more poetic piano playing than his.
Yep. Yeah. Listen to his Schubert, you know, his
big time.
Unbelievable. So we have time for a couple more. If anyone wants to chime in.
I was wondering, in the New World Symphony and in most pieces, there's a lot of themes that come back again. So how do you make each one like new for the audience or interesting again?
Sorry that I laugh a bit when I heard that question, but you know, when a theme comes back, it's already by what has happened before. Even if it's exactly the same as the first time, the impression for the listener is already a different one, because there is the recognition factor. Yeah. So you have heard a theme exposed in the beginning, and then you hear it somewhat again, maybe in the development section, and you hear it maybe exactly the same way written like the first time. But in the meantime, you have gone through all that, having heard another theme, which of course is in a relationship with the first theme. So I think it's actually a mistake to say, oh, how can I make that more interesting when it comes back, you know, played upside down or whatever. I think you have to take into account that for the listener, as he goes through that journey, the theme, even though it might be exactly 100% the same way written as the first time, it doesn't sound the same way because you had already an experience.
We talked actually about this. Dvorak is so clever. Even if, oh, this melody comes back, there's always something different. Always.
Yeah.
could be, maybe it's written in octaves, maybe it's a different voice playing it, maybe is it there's always something that's surprising. So it's never,
I sort of make a little variation on what I said before. If it's a masterpiece, don't worry about making it interesting when it comes back. If it's not a good piece, you should worry about it and try to make it more interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a couple more here, and then we'll wrap up. So, what is a habit or a practice, a tenet of yours that's really been, that's helped you out a lot, that you have really gone to in terms of just, what a successful career you have, and just, a life?
I mean, first of all, yoga is something which I do daily. And then what helps me, as we talked about Radu Lupo, he was always extremely nervous before concerts. So what helped him was always 10 minutes before a performance, or even right before we went on together onto a stage, he would tell me a joke. And most of the times it was a dirty joke he told me. But that was his way of dealing with being as nervous as he was. For me, and Vinay knows that, for me, the routine is I want to chat with people before a performance. I don't want to sort of concentrate. Also during intermission, I sort of want to divert my attention from the performance. And then a routine of mine is also when and I've kept that now for decades, when I've a performance in the evening, the afternoon is totally off. So, I have lunch, I take a nap, I take a walk, I watch television. Again, I try sort of to divert my attention from I have to conduct a performance, because what you have not prepared until then, you're not going to achieve anymore. So the work has to be done. And then I just try to sort of entertain myself.
I hate being in the dressing room by myself. I hate it. It's the worst thing. It's just like, get me out of here. It's the worst. So.
Yeah, but people are different. I've met artists where if you go to their dressing room, they yell at you and say, go away, go away. Yeah. Everyone is different.
Yeah. There are a couple more here. And so one, usually how many projects or programs are you taking on at once? Obviously, you might have 4 weeks of concerts with you in Cleveland, but there's obviously something after that always, so.
Yeah, I would say throughout the season, I have got about 20 to 25 different complete symphonic programs. And then now I try to limit myself to 2 different operas this season. In my first season as music director at the Vienna State Opera, I conducted 11 different operas. 4 of them were the Ring Cycle. So tons of music, tons. You only can do that if you have enough experience, which I had built up by then. But nowadays, I try to reduce it because I want to have more time to study and try to dive even deeper into pieces. So, but I would say between 20 and 25.
And I think we'll end with this one. I don't want to keep you all evening, but what is the biggest challenge you've had to overcome in your career as a musician and conductor? It's probably good for advice for all of us.
I just last August came out a book in German, and it will come out in English as well, where I talk about my life. It's not a biography. It's very much about my views on our business and so on. So you might get the chance to read it. The biggest hurdle I had to overcome was my failure when I was music director of the London Philharmonic. That was a terrible time from 1990 till 96, where I was beaten up like crazy by the press. And that really destroyed my self-confidence. And I had to sort of reinvent myself. I was at a point in February 1994 where I thought about to stop conducting altogether and go back to the university and learn something else. I thought about becoming a lawyer. But that was really difficult. And you know, of course we expose ourselves when we go onto stage, but when you know you go on stage and you will be panned the next day by the media over and over and over again for 6 years. And you know, it was like Lenny Bernstein when he was music director of the New York Philharmonic. For 10 years he didn't get a good review. You know, these are rough times. That was really the biggest hurdle, because it nearly destroyed my self-confidence completely. So, and it took me years and years really to overcome that. And it was, you know, when you're so down as much as I was at that time, your personal life starts to suffer, your health starts to suffer, and so on and so on. So, but at the same time, looking back, it was an enormous test. Life tested me. And you know, when I started my professional career in the mid-80s, I ran from one success to the next. And then in London, it was the opposite, the total, complete opposite. And, you know, with certain media, to the very day, some of that is hanging on. And, but you learn when you overcome it, and when you have overcome it, and again, it took me years to overcome that, you're stronger, and you just laugh at these people.
What do you think helped you the most to get through that? Because I think as musicians, we all go through times where there's intense self-doubt and we think about quitting.
Yeah. The personal environment, you know, and I think that's the one thing which we should learn is very quickly is don't trust everyone who tells you you're great. Because they don't mean it. And you try to create a personal environment where people tell you the truth. It starts with your partner in life, my wife. It's the friends you have. You have to be humble enough that other people respectfully, but still can tell you, you know, this was shit. Yeah. And so but it's up to yourself that you have such an environment, and you don't have an environment where people just tell you all the time you're great, because nobody is, you know. The famous Carlos Kleiber, who was also incredibly nervous before performances like Rado, and afterwards he always would ask people, how did I do? How did I do? You know, and people were cheering and forever, and he felt insecure and uncertain if he did a good job. And I think it's really, really important to have a good personal environment that keeps you sane.
Oh, this was so amazing. Are there any last quick questions before we wrap up today? Franz, this was such a treat. We're so appreciative that you joined us. I mean, this was just unbelievable. So
Sure.
thank you so much. And I will see you in a couple weeks. Yeah. So
if you ever come to Austria, go and see my library.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
People ask me, how many scores and how many books I have in here, and it's about 7,000 scores, and it's about 3,000 to 4,000 books.
Oh my
A
goodness.
lot to learn.
For sure. Good lesson for all of us. So
Okay, guys, that was fun.
I'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take
Great.
care.
Thank you. Stay safe. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.